Hello everyone, welcome. What a beautiful venue. Thank you so much for being here. We're so glad that you're here. This is such an important time that we come together and have community conversations, talk to each other again in face-to-face connection. These events are built for you, so in that spirit, please say hello to each other, next to each other, behind each other. Can you just say hello to each other and welcome each other in that spirit? If you can't, just do a wave up the back. Hi everyone, welcome to Brisbane. I'm a Brisbane girl. So here we are again, proving it's still possible to come together and have not just civil but productive, enlightening and even enjoyable public discussions between differing speakers, differing opinions, and some of the most challenging issues of our time, and tonight's topic is certainly, definitely one of those. So I'm your MC, I'm Professor Selena Bartlett. I'm very excited to be here. I'm a neuroscientist, I'm a pharmacist, I've studied the brain for 30 years, and I did that from 1989 because my sister had a mental illness not far from here. She was put in a lock-up ward and I didn't like how she was treated, and I thought we mustn't know how the brain works, and so I set about doing that around the world for 30 years. I worked it out and now I'm trying to change how we treat that in our society. So I'm so excited about this panel. The people are amazing, and as a mother of 2 Gen Z children with their partners and 3 millennials with their partners, with my second husband, I love these people and I have the most amazing conversations. So I'm very familiar with the polycrises that has been handed to this generation, whether it's parents being absent or applying pressure to succeed, whether it's climate change and how it's being dealt with, whether it's housing prices and being priced out of the market, whether it's HECS debt, etc. I hear about this on almost a daily basis. Or where their jobs are becoming less secure and how the gig economy is really leading to less security. And then, of course, the COVID pandemic that's really added fire to all of that. So I'm very familiar with this and how they feel. But tonight, I want to tell you that I just came from Canberra as a witness in the Social Media and Society panel, and I was there yesterday. So I'm first-hand experiencing the division in this topic, and so I'm really looking forward to having that conversation with you tonight. So for those who are here, the Brisbane Dialogues is the country's first dedicated civil discourse bridging organisation, and I can tell that just from what I experienced 5 minutes ago. It's amazing the level of conversation, the depth, and how people can talk with each other in a civil manner. And across the aisle. It's entirely independent, neutral, non-partisan, volunteer-based organisation. The Big Dialogues has been running for 4 years, as some of you may know, at both the Tivoli and Princess Theatres, bringing people together across ideological, generational and otherwise, enabling deep conversations on big issues and challenges. And don't we need that right now in our society? We need to come together because together we're better, and community level conversations are exactly what we need. We don't need any more division, we've got enough of it. Helping us model better public discussions and feel like we're part of our country again, that we have agency to make some decisions, to know that we're very powerful. This is the first one outside Brisbane, was held in Melbourne a fortnight ago on energy transition, a collaboration with an interesting pairing of think tanks and a sequel to the one is in this place last year. I don't know how many of you, hands up if you were here last year. Woohoo, yay. The next one will be in Canberra on November the 13th, and that one's going to be on arts funding policy in collaboration with the Australian Academy of Humanities. So the precedent is set for many more big dialogues around the country with local coalitions of the willing. This is my kind of place. A diverse umbrella network of organisations where each see the need and like for what the dialogues are doing. This is really critical in our country. I can't think of a more critical thing each of us could be doing to make our country better for everybody. There's also a schools program, Dialogues at School, a private monthly discussion group being renamed Tuesday Dialogues, and several other interesting discussion events which I really welcome you to go and look at. Lastly, we have the Brisbane Rule, which was created at the launch of the dialogues, which I think is really important because we're each human beings up here and all around, and we want to respect each other from that place. So it's a variation of the Chatham House Rule, which many will know and has been adapted for public events in the digital age. So all participants agree to listen carefully, speak respectfully, and concentrate on the content, not the characters, before, during, and afterwards, online as well as offline. So please silence your mobile phones. Fire exits are clearly marked. You can see where the bathrooms are, indicating to your left, while male and unisex or gender-neutral restrooms can be found, indicating on the right here. So it's customary for us to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the place where we gather and converse. And I want to share with you what messages have been delivered to me by elders in many communities around Queensland. And I think this really resonated for me, and especially for what we're trying to achieve tonight. And they said, let silence do the heavy lifting. And that's so important, isn't it? Because what that means is we're listening and sitting in silence. It means you have to spend the time to not think in your mind what you're going to say, but to really listen to what they're saying. And when you start to do that, everything in your life starts to change, because often we're kind of got it a bit wrong. And I've started to notice that with my 83-year-old father. So this is in the spirit of Aboriginal culture that's very old, and it's a culture of deep listening in these circles. It's very powerful, and it's called dadiri. It's a word used in some languages to describe the practice and the inner deep listening and quiet, still awareness, and you just feel so much better afterwards. So let's bear this ancient wisdom in mind tonight. Listen carefully to different views, and this is essential. Our country really needs it right now. I want to thank the donors on behalf of the dialogues. And I'd like to thank at least some of the many people who have contributed, especially to the speakers here, some from Melbourne, Mackay. I'm so grateful that they could all be here. Very busy people, and everyone's volunteered substantially their time and effort on top of their normal high workloads. This is as true of a Gen Z panel as it is of anybody. And to our major in-kind sponsors, Steve and Dave Sleswick, owners of the Tivoli, thank you. This venue is absolutely beautiful. And co-owners of the Princess, another beautiful place to go to in Brisbane. And all of the staff here, thank you so much for doing this. It has provided what the dialogues call their home, and what a special one it is. If you have the slightest excuse, please book this venue for any event, professional or personal, and I'm certainly going to be doing that. Special thanks are also due to Edwin Davis of Pure Gold Films, who have provided the high-quality video for every big dialogue, contributing significantly to its success alongside his thriving commercial videography business. We also like to thank and acknowledge financial sponsors, the Eucalyptus Academy, who have become an all-round partner over several years, and donors Bill Chatterton, Tony and Dwyer, and Steve and Jane Wilson, who are helping take the dialogues national. So important. And feed everyone tonight. Yay, thank you. And of course, a huge thanks to the premium ticket buyers and the small band of volunteers and the many others individually and organisationally who enable all of this to happen. So, before introducing the speakers, I'd like to encourage everyone to text questions to this number. Succinct, relevant questions with names given, may be used later. There will also be time for a few live questions from the floor. So now over to our speakers that you've come here to listen to tonight. Daniel Cash. Welcome, Daniel Cash. And just if you hold your applause till I call everyone out. Gen Z writer and speaker providing a youth perspective to mainstream media and law student at Australian National University. Freya Leach, Director, Youth Policy, Menzies Research Centre, and also a law student, as it happens, at the University of Sydney. Lachlan Lade, advocate for youth in politics, entrepreneur and Libertarian Party Senate candidate from the Mackay-Proserpine region. And last but not least, Peter Greste, Professor of Journalism, Macquarie University, journalist, author, speaker, and media freedom advocate. Please join me in welcoming all the speakers to the stage. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you very much, Selena. It's a fantastic honour to be here. This is, as a journalist, this is a subject that is very, very close to my heart. You know, my whole job, my whole professional life has been about communicating. It's been about the media, and this is something, in fact, that we were discussing in the green room just beforehand. And I feel as though my world, in a lot of respects, my relevance has been usurped by the machines, by social media. It's taken over that role of media as the means by which we communicate, not just communicate with each other, but the means in which we discuss and debate and understand the world around us. And so the impact of social media on young people is a particularly interesting thing for me. It's something I'm deeply concerned about, but also find myself very ambivalent. I find myself highly conflicted because, of course, as someone who is a part of the media, the whole idea of freedom of speech, of the ability to articulate freely and engage with the world around you is also been a very central to my own professional and personal existence. So it is a fantastic honour to be here. It's a wonderful discussion, and I am joined by three extraordinary panellists. You've already had the introduction, so I'm going to go straight into the questions. And Freya, I want to begin with you. You've spoken, you've written quite a bit about the American psychologist Jonathan Haidt, who rather colourfully says Instagram really takes on the worst aspects of high school and glossy women's magazines and amplifies them. You grew up with social media. What was your experience?
Like the typical Gen Z, I got my first social media account when I was 12 years old, 21 now. So it was a significant part of my teenage years. And it was interesting. I think when I first got social media, it was 2014. My parents are good, involved parents. They had no idea that what they were giving me was essentially the alcohol or cigarettes of the 21st century. And when I first got it, I also didn't think there was anything wrong with it. It was great. I could see my friends, I could look at cute videos of puppies, and it was wonderful. But as I went through high school, the impact that it had, particularly on girls, became more and more noticeable. In about year 9, when we were around 14 years old, that's when eating disorders and mental illness really became prevalent. And anecdotally, as I looked around my year group, the girls that were on social media the most, seemingly the most popular, the coolest online, were often the ones that experienced the worst of the mental health issues in our cohort. So my perspective on it really changed. And then when I discovered the research around really what it is doing to young children's brains, it caused me great concern. And now in my role at the Menzies Research Centre, I was involved in writing the policy that actually led Peter Dutton to come out to say he would ban social media for under-16s.
You mentioned the research, and you write about this in one of the pieces that you've written for Menzies, and you said that there's been a 52% increase in psychological distress among girls aged 15 to 19 since 2012. 52%. In total, 39% of young people aged between 16 and 24 suffered a mental disorder in the last year, and that's compared with 26% in 2007 and 27% in 1997. But we also know that correlation isn't the same as causation. How can we be sure that social media is behind these figures?
So if you look at the rates of mental illness over time, they were always pretty high for young women in particular, and young people generally. But in about 2012, there was this inflection point where all of a sudden the rates of mental illness just went through the roof. And now, as you said, there's been a 52% increase in psychological illnesses since 2012. So how do we know that it's actually social media causing it? Well, there's not really any other explanation. There are things that could be contributing: the decline of faith, the atomization of society, broken homes, economic circumstances, but nothing explains the magnitude of the change, the international nature of the crisis, and the way it's particularly affected young people. And since in the last couple of years there's been a lot of research, academic research done into actually establishing from an academic perspective that link, and the correlation between social media use and mental illness for young women is stronger than the correlation between lead and lower IQ. The lead in pipes is enough to, we still have stereotypes about the Romans from lead in pipes. It's enough to launch a huge public health campaign to remove lead, yet the correlation between social media and mental illness is even stronger than that. So why are we not taking similar action?
Lachlan, social media is like lead. Surely the obvious answer is to do what we did with lead pipes and to ban them.
Well, Freya touched on a perfect point. And I think that really, when we're faced with these sort of questions about, do we want the government to take a larger role in controlling our lives, we need to first ask the question, is the family better equipped to deal with this issue? And so Freya, like Freya mentioned, a public health campaign, look, I'm certainly in agreement with, because I've experienced it myself. I've seen my younger brothers and my friends who have children, they use it as a babysitting tool. But this is not particularly new to our generation. Every generation has new technologies that they have to learn how to best wield, manage, and learn to use going forward, whether it be electricity, the automobile, or guns. They all have incredible potential, but the potential for dangers as well. So that's where I would always come back to, whether or not the family is best equipped to deal with this issue.
So just to be clear, you're not disputing the dangers and the impact of social media on young people's mental health?
No, absolutely not. I can see that clearly, and I think all of us are in agreement that there is a real issue here. It's just that how do we best tackle this issue? Because if I may, if you may indulge me, you see, I see this as a very clear stepping stone towards what is also a conversation as of late, and that is digital ID, because it's not the children who are going to have to register themselves to access social media. It's yourself and myself. We'll have to provide the identification to the government. And that's an enormous amount of identity and power that I think that we are handing over to them, because we always remember all politicians are temporary. And one day they may be corrupt or evil individuals who want to enact more control over our lives.
We'll come back to some of the sort of forms of technology that we could be using to manage this in a moment. But you disagree fundamentally with the idea of removing access to young people to their social media accounts?
Yes. Well, of course. I mean, again, I think parents lack the awareness of actually how severe it is. I didn't know what other that Freya gave us about lead just then. So a public health campaign for parents to better understand that, and perhaps education as well within the schooling system for those themselves, removing the phones from individuals who are at school, for sure. But when it comes to families and their children, I always would want to look to empowering the parents first.
Daniel, you tried a really interesting experiment recently. You started out going for a week with a dumb phone, using an old-fashioned flip phone without internet access. Tell us about that experience. How was it for you?
So it was inconvenient, was the main point, Peter. I was in a university group assignment and I had to text one of my friends individually so she could pass on my points. I couldn't scan QR codes, stuff like that. At one point I had the vague sensation that perhaps war had broken out and I was the only person who didn't know about it. But
maybe that's not such a bad thing.
Well, I kind of stumbled upon that point as I looked at the other commuters on the tram, as I enviously watched them over their shoulder scrolling TikTok. That's probably true. So correlation, causation, whatever, the fact that we know is that there's a good study by the Resolution Foundation this year. Young people 20 years ago had the lowest incidence of common mental disorders out of any age group. Now we have the highest, right? Go figure. And the fact that we have these devices which impact our lives more than any other technological advance, more than the telephone, the steamship put together, right? A Harris poll last week in the US found that teens there, on average, spend more than 4 hours a day on their phone. No other advance has made that impact. So that would be my response to the correlation causation thing. But with my dumb phone, I found all these inconveniences, but they were innocent, they were simple. Not being able to scan a QR code or text a uni group assignment is a quite benevolent problem. Whereas the problems my smartphone caused me and my generation, well, the proliferation of eating disorders among mainly young women, the rise of radicalisation and aggressive masculinity of young men who are driven into the arms of people like Andrew Tate, they are much more insipid, invasive problems, and they're the ones that a smartphone causes.
How did it feel being without that connection, without social media?
Probably, I don't remember it, but when my umbilical cord was cut,
but I mean,
probably like that.
But I mean, during that experiment, when you had the dumb phone?
I had anticipated like a hermit-like reconnection with nature, wearing no shoes, grounding myself to the earth. That didn't happen. I was bored, really, and I had a surplus of free time, which I thought I'd use doing like sit-ups and stuff, but I didn't. I lasted 3 days.
I was going to say, you didn't go the week. You didn't go
people
the
in The
distance.
Age, Sydney Morning Herald comments kind of lambasted me for only lasting 3 days. But I think I was speaking my sister to one of her mates in her share house about the social media ban. So she's 23, Allegra's her name, and she said, so what age is the proposed ban going to? And I said, probably 16. And she said, oh shit, I wish it went to 25. Like, I want an excuse for all of us to get off our phones. Because that's the main point. Like, for me, it was inconvenient, but young people, we're like a tyrant's lackeys. We all don't like the tyrant. We all realise that it's causing pain and inflicting hurt. But individually, we're not empowered to depose that tyrant. So I, as one person, shedding my phone, it wasn't enough. It needs to be group.
So unusually, I think, for the Brisbane dialogues, we have a consensus within the first 5 minutes of the conversation. That
could I make a disagreement? I would argue, Lachlan, that on the question of whether parents are best empowered to look after their kids.
We'll come to this in a minute. I do want to raise... We will come to this, but I just want to...
I didn't want you to think anyone's agreeing.
No. Well, I mean, in terms of... Well, the fundamental question is, should we be stopping underage or under 16-year-olds from accessing social media? And there seems to be a consensus that it's a problem, that we need to be doing that. I see 3 people nodding. Just out of curiosity, I can see a few young faces in the audience. Hands up for those of you who fit into the category, the under 16 that we're talking about. There are a few people. Yeah, there are a few people in the audience here, and I wonder how many of you, just if you've got your hands up, would feel comfortable giving up social media. No, there are a few hands that didn't go up. You see, it's interesting because we've got consensus up here. The people that would be most affected by this wouldn't necessarily agree with you. Freya?
It's interesting because so at the Menzies Research Centre, when we were developing this policy, we polled a whole range of people. But surprisingly, there is actually support for age verification even among under 18s. And Facebook's own internal research found that young people consistently blamed the social media companies themselves and social media platforms for their worsening mental health, and that was unprompted and consistent across ages. So even though I relate, guys, social media was a big part of my teenage years as well, but when you actually look at the whole generation, maybe they don't want to have it banned, but young people on the whole will still acknowledge that it is the thing driving the deterioration in mental health. So then the question becomes, knowing the impact it's having, knowing that young people themselves think it's having a bad impact on their mental health, what should we do about it?
This comes back to one of the discussions that I've had, and I think Lockie raised this. As a parent, as a step-parent, I've found when we've tried to limit access to social media, the kids have said, we can't because you're stopping us from having our own social networks. This is how we communicate. This is how we organise ourselves, our social lives. And if you take that away from us, we become isolated. That's a really difficult thing for parents. Now, there's some research, I think, that says that most young people don't want to be off social media if they know that their friends are on it, but if they know their friends are not on it, then it becomes a lot easier to give it up. Lockie, you said parents are best placed, and Daniel, I'll come to you on this, come back to you on this, but are you sure that parents really have the capacity to, and the strength, particularly in the face of the kind of social pressure, to take their phones off their kids, or at least stop those social media apps?
Well, if their intentions are to give their children, the best life they can, I'm sure they would be strong enough to do that. The other thing I think we need to remember is that this is digital consumption as a whole, right? So there's a lot of children who are, and I'd argue actually probably more children who are playing video games on their phones and mobile devices than there are on social media. And all of these games as well have these chat services on them, have their own social networks built into them. So it's an enormous task what we're asking the government to do here, because I think social media is really just an excuse when it's digital entertainment consumption as a whole that is the big issue we're facing.
Danny?
If you were on a highway with your family careening towards an oncoming truck, would you prefer a seatbelt over your kid, or is it the job of the mother or father to thrust their arm so that they don't go into the windscreen? There are these huge companies with very little oversight that make tons and tons of money that successfully implement changes and restrictions when it serves their commercial interests. I think parents, from my point of view, even the most well-meaning, aren't nearly as well equipped as the companies whose actual everyday job is monitoring and controlling their platform. And when it's left to parents to control how their kids live with social media, that brings many other problems. For example, it'll be wealthier parents with more time on their hands who are more well-read on the issue, who are going to be able to protect their kids better. And you'll see systematic disadvantages there. I think I understand your point on infringements on freedoms and the importance of keeping a wary eye on that. But again, we don't look back on seatbelts or airbags as the nanny state gone mad. And potentially, I think in 50 years, if a ban does come in place, we won't look back on restrictions on content for minors, for people under 16, so that they can't see, you were saying live streaming Hamas. They can't see that when they're on the tram on the way to school. I personally don't think that's too huge a leap.
So you're saying parents can't monitor their kids when they're doom scrolling at 2 a.m?
I think at this stage, you really need a degree, you need 10 years studying the thing, and you need access to the algorithm to be able to make a change.
Freya, you look poised for...
Yeah, well, I think what's happening here is there are a lot of well-meaning parents out there, and the vast majority want to do what's best for their kids. But the dilemma faced by parents is, do you, on the one hand, let your kid be on social media because that's their whole social network, it's fun, it makes them happy, or do you take them off social media because you know the harms, you know the dangers, but then now they're socially isolated and they're the one person in their friend group that's not getting invited to the party because they don't have Instagram and they can't see it or whatever. So the dilemma faced by parents is, listen to the science, get your kid off, but then does that actually do more harm than good? Because then now your child is the only one who's not going to be on social media.
And you develop a real hatred and you your kid
and
towards you, resentment.
Oh, for sure. And then major resentment because of the social isolation that your kid will probably feel. So it's a collective action problem where unless the majority of parents decide we're all going to get our kids off social media, no parent really wants to be the first one to say that to their kids. So that's why a ban for children under 16, I think, would be helpful because it would change the culture. Now the default would be, no, you can't have social media. I understand maybe one or two of your friends have it, but look, it's against the law and the majority don't. Whereas at the moment, if you, as a parent, you're basically isolated, you're the only one. And unless there's a critical mass of other parents also making that decision for their kids, you risk just creating resentment and more isolation and hurt for your child than might be the case if they were on social media.
Lachlan, we'll come to the whole issues around government control of information in a moment, but in practical terms, what's wrong with what Freya's suggesting?
Well, the sentiment's quite right, but the thing is, you're going to have to take that phone away. Because as I just mentioned, a lot of the time sink is actually in video games that have their own chat services. So social media is just one aspect of their lives. And it's important to regulate it for its own reasons, perhaps. And that's why I'd really rather go with a public health campaign, help parents and everyone understand the issue. But they'll go around that and use perhaps Discord. That's extremely common right now. Maybe Telegram and Roblox, extremely popular with the youth, and it has its own chat service where everybody has their own animated character in the game. So it's a massive issue that really the only solution is to take the technology away. And if parents do that, if parents don't have the time to spend that time with their kids, that's a struggle that all of society is facing. You know, parents work too much and the technology is a good babysitter.
Danny, how easy is it to get around some of these kind of technical problems for kids?
It's an important thing to consider, and I'm sure Freya will have good insights on this, but you know, we learnt from the 20s that prohibition often popularises that which it intends to prohibit. And so prohibition for social media will probably just produce the 14-year-old equivalent of bootleggers, which would be monsters to live with, no doubt. And there's stuff like, you know, for my old school Wi-Fi, certain websites were blocked that had video games on them. Kids knew how to have VPNs and get around it. So that's something that really needs to be fleshed out. I think it's important that we figure out how much of this stuff is gaming, like you're saying, Lockie, or social media. But I think it comes down to the majority of teens in the US wish that apps like Snapchat, Facebook, and Instagram didn't exist in their childhood, right? There's already this yearning for an authenticity and a healthiness that we're not growing up with. So I think, I personally think that the issue is social media. I know you can communicate on stuff like Roblox, but I don't think people are planning parties on Roblox or circulating images of the Kardashians.
But presumably they would if that was the only way that they could do it.
I don't. We're straying into, that's not my expertise now. I think the main issue are these apps like the Snapchats and the TikToks. But I agree with Freya's point that there is a collective action issue. That's what my point about Allegra, my sister's housemate. She has the urge to get off social media, but the problem is everyone's on it. So maybe a bump in the direction would be helpful.
You wrote recently about Snapchat in particular, and you said, and Snapchat isn't one of the ones that keeps coming up routinely, these conversations. It's Facebook, it's X, it's Instagram, and so on. What is it about Snapchat that concerned you in particular?
So the more I thought about it, when I actually sat down to write about it, the more I realised, oh my God, that's horrible. So the average user opens Snapchat 40 times a day, and 83...
Sorry, just for our audience, a lot of whom might not really be familiar with Snapchat, just describe what is that makes it unique, that makes it special.
So it's an instant messaging app. It's got kind of a fun design. You can text your friends on it. 83% of kids between 12 and 17 in Australia have it, so it's super popular. Your messages delete after 24 hours. If you don't send a photo of your face or a selfie to your friend within 24 hours, your streak of talking to each other goes away. And there are all these problems that are normalised that we only realise once we think about them. So I say...
And there's a mapping system as well, isn't there, that you can locate yourself and your friends, which is also particularly pernicious.
Completely. So first there's the Snap map, where you can see where everyone is on the last time they opened the app. So Freya 3 minutes ago at the Tivoli, and most people engage with this feature. And so that's got huge problems when it comes to coercive control, domestic violence, but also, you know, your mum says, oh, do you want to come to the shops with me? You check Snap Maps to see if you have to put effort into your outfit, because who's going to be down the street? Like, it's changing the way we live and not for the better. So there's real dangers there. I bring up the fact that users open Snapchat on average 40 times a day, because the first thing you see when you open it is the selfie camera, is your own reflection. No wonder people are so body conscious and unhappy with the way we look. As a generation, we are confronted with our own appearances 1,000 times more than ever before. And that is just fundamentally unhealthy and also vain. So even apps like Snapchat, which don't get the same coverage that Facebook, Instagram, TikTok have, they're seriously pernicious in ways that haven't even yet been studied in the mainstream.
Freya, you're nodding. Do you recognise that issue?
Definitely. And one of the interesting things about Snapchat is with the streaks, like the social, it's like a social credit score, but among your peers, because you have a snap score. It's literally called a snap score, and that's determined by how many people you Snapchat and you know, your activity on the app. So if you've got a higher snap score, it's like you're really cool because clearly you're talking to a lot of people up to a certain point. If your snap score is too high, then it's like, wow, you really have no life outside of Snapchat. So there's this real sweet spot there where you're really cool. But it's...
And it also ranks your best friends on how much you talk to them.
And you have a best friend ranking system on the app based on how much you talk to them. So the ability for a social media site to totally quantify how cool you are, who you speak to, your location, literally everything about your social life is kind of terrifying. And I think what it does to kids is it just places enormous pressure on them, like unbelievable amounts of pressure.
And you also point out that social media has a particular impact on girls as well. Can you explain that?
Yes, so when you look at the mental health data, clearly everything's gotten worse for all young people, but the deterioration has been worse for girls. So since 2012, the rate of hospitalisation for intentional self-harm for girls under 14 has gone up by 221%. And you're just not seeing those same dramatic increases among guys. It's still bad, but it's not that bad. So what social media does, I think, for girls is you don't want to be a girl going through puberty ever. It's just an uncomfortable, awkward stage of life. You're not that, you know, you think when you hit 14, you're going to be like the coolest person ever. You're really not. And so imagine going through that, but then having to broadcast every single moment of that to 300 people on Instagram, all of your school friends on Snapchat, and then constantly comparing yourself on the social media feed to 25-year-old supermodels. You are always going to feel inadequate, ugly, unworthy of love and attention. And that, I think, is why it really affects girls more. Guys, so you talked about the video game side of things. That's what guys do more. They play video games and then they use these platforms to connect with friends. Girls don't do that as much. These platforms are about scrolling through the feed, comparing yourself to models, endless online shopping. And so it's a very different use of technology and of social media, and it's a lot worse because of that constant social comparison.
Daniel, you said that the solution to the Snapchat problem in your article was wasn't a ban, but a decision by users to stop using it. Now, given the kind of addictive nature of the thing, given the features that you've described, is that really the solution?
Well, thank you for pointing me out there, Peter, when I might have changed my opinion since then. I think Murray brought me in because I'm more the middle of the road. I see quite keenly the problems with the ban, and my points, my main problem, alongside the practical issue, will it work, is in principle, social media is the setting of this behaviour. So bullying, extortion, abuse, body image issues, that's all occurring within the environment of social media. So there's the danger that a ban could be seen as the plug-stop solution, and then we can dust our hands and be done with it. No, the problem is the abuse, the bullying, the extortion, the body image issues, right? So we need to target the behaviours, not just the setting in which they occur, and that's a much more labour-intensive thing to have to work around.
But you say it's the behaviour, but surely the behaviour is triggered by the algorithms, by the design of the systems that are supposed to tweak our deepest instincts. It's not something that we can easily control.
And especially if you're 12 years old. But I think it's a vicious cycle. The system plays in on itself. So you talk about feelings of inadequacy because young girls grow up comparing themselves to supermodels. The supermodels, who are the paragons of beauty in our time for these people, they also, you know, say the Kardashian standard of beauty. I was speaking with my sister about this the other day. They not only have the help often of cosmetic surgeons, but they edit their own photos. They post photos to hundreds of millions of followers with slimmer waists that have been photoshopped. The inadequacy goes right to the top because the system drives that, and then we buy back into it and perpetuate this cycle.
Lachie, what do you say? What's your response to that idea? I mean, we're talking about a system that's designed to really tweak our basic instincts. And as Danny pointed out, asking a 12-year-old to manage that, asking parents to enforce restrictions, kids' access to social media, particularly when kids have the capacity to find workarounds, that's a really tough thing. Are you really expecting that to be the solution?
Well, look, I fully identify the issues that we're facing here because I've got friends who never leave the house. They play their video games, they're on social media, it gives them a sense of achievement, and they're not out there living life, building memories. So I fully appreciate that. But here's another issue that we need to realise. For example, I was one of the first cohorts to get a computer at school. The school system banned a lot of websites, banned a lot of applications, so I turned my own computer into a router. Everyone connected to me and we all played video games off my computer. It was terrific. But same thing goes with these social media applications, okay? You're going to have independent programmers putting out independent apps that aren't on the App Store, that individuals on iPhone and Android can download, circumventing the App Store, these brand new apps that the government has not regulated, that have not implemented this ID verification, and they'll just continue communicating as they already were. Probably within their own little social network groups because it won't necessarily be as large as Snapchat, Facebook, etc. But they can copy the code, change a little bit, repeat the app. So I see us starting a game of whack-a-mole to some extent, and that's why, again, I'll say it's a public health issue that we're facing here, and it's a major one that we need all parents and individuals to be more aware of.
But what's your response to Freya's point that even if a few people will find access, some kids will still get access to the grog cabinet, even if we still ban it? You're not suggesting that, therefore, just because kids can open up their parents' booze cabinet, doesn't mean that we should simply give free access to underage kids to alcohol, surely? True.
And I can't speak on the experiences that Freya and others of other females have gone through exactly in that regard. So there's valid points, and there's going to be some good arguments in that relation, but then maybe I won't go there just yet, but I do have great concern on what this is enabling down the line when it comes to handing over such identity and regulation to the government.
Well, let's go there, because you mentioned it earlier and I cut you off. You said you were concerned about about the kind of implications of a ban. Can you explain that in more depth, what you mean?
Well, so as I mentioned, right, the ID verification is for the adults, not the children. So that means all of us are the ones that are going to have to be handing over our identification documents to the government. In my view, that's an enormous amount of power that we're giving a centralized entity. If you put aside even just the data breaches that could come with that, we've lived through some experiences that should help us connect to where this could go. You see, digital ID is a hot conversation right now. Just last week as well, this last weekend, we've had protests in Sydney and Melbourne against the proposed misinformation bills, of which Liberals and Labor are both looking to bring in their own versions. That's why I say I think that this social media regulation is just the excuse to implement further control, tracking, etc. of the adults and control of the information. Because you need to have everybody identified if you're going to start censoring people. And we've gone through that, especially with where digital ID can lead. We had vaccine passports not 3 years ago, where I was hounded before I could enter into some Woolworths and Coles, unless I gave over my personal medical information. And we also know that a lot of advice that was given to us from the government would be today deemed misinformation. So I just see that if we start giving the government more power and the ability to know where we are through IP addresses when we access these social media platforms and to know who exactly we are, we're potentially going down a path that I have great concern where we'll arrive at, because it's going to be incredibly hard for us to take a step back.
Aren't you concerned? I mean, you're doing that already to the social media companies. You're giving your identity, your location, your whereabouts, your political opinions to private companies that sit unaccountable offshore. At least if the government has it, you know that they've got it, and there are mechanisms for accountability.
You can turn off those services. So the only thing that Facebook has is my name and my email address. But as well, those private companies can't arrest me for something I say online.
I think Facebook would have more than your name and email address. Just recently it was found that through the third-party advertisers, some social media groups were pushing pregnancy tests to women before that they knew they were pregnant, because they could tell from what they were engaging with on the app they had cravings that women, when they're about to become pregnant, normally have. So I think perhaps there's more than just your email and stuff like that they have. But so it's in real life already, though, in physical face-to-face social situations, no one has any problem with the government knowing who you are when you speak. Surely that's just a question of accountability.
But you're not concerned about those privacy issues?
I think I am, but like you say, I have faith in our institutions. Luckily, we live in a democracy where there are laws of transparency, and as it stands, the groups which command our information exist in Silicon Valley, and their motives aren't for the people, by the people, of the people. Their motives are to the shareholder and to their portfolio, which isn't a very wholesome motive.
Lachie?
Well, data harvesting, which you're referring to with the government, with those social media companies taking our data for their own profit, that's another issue. There's another issue that I think we should retain power over that data, and that's a separate regulatory issue. And I would just have to say that I have a lot less trust in our government after what they've done, and after I've seen these proposed misinformation bills that will protect them, but always look to control us to an extent, protect the establishment, but not us. So the government needs to remember that their job is to protect our privacy, protect our freedoms, and keep themselves transparent. And I just think this just goes hand in hand with digital ID. And as I mentioned, remember, all politicians are temporary, and this is the perfect path to then go into central banking digital currencies, social credit scores, etc. We need to maintain a separation there. And that's what I'm thinking.
Freya, is age verification ever going to work?
So I think you raised a few points there. The first one around age verification, you don't necessarily have to have the parent's ID going into the social media company.
Do you want the kids to?
Or going into the... So the first question is, how does age verification actually work? There are third-party platforms that can provide age verification services. There are all sorts of ways you could do it. You don't need to have the parent's ID being uploaded. In Queensland, as in New South Wales and around Australia, you can have proof of age cards if you're 15 or over. So that's a government-issued ID that verifies your age. You can then scan that, and a third-party system can verify that that's a legitimate ID based on how it looks, and then they can communicate that to the social media company. So you don't have to be uploading your ID to some central government database, but realistically, they have all your data anyway, and you don't need to be uploading it to the social media site directly, even though they probably also have all your data anyway. You can actually upload it to a safer third-party platform, but all those logistics are things we can work out. But the point is, it's not fatal to this argument. You don't have to be uploading every adult's passport to some government website and then they'll track you on social media. That's not how it's going to work, and there are ways we can get around that. And then to your point about the misinformation bill and how this could potentially be used to track people online, currently, the way our social media is regulated is we have the e-safety commissioner. The e-safety commissioner, there's a voluntary code that all the social media companies are part of. If there is content that is deemed extremely harmful, you will then be compelled by the e-safety commissioner to take that down. That is the extent of our current social media regulations. In my opinion, that is actually more harmful for free speech, because we are now taking a content-based approach where some bureaucrat sitting somewhere has to judge whether a certain piece of content is harmful or not. What is defined as harm? I don't know. How do you police that? We don't really know. The fundamental issue, the fundamental harm that social media is causing is not, violent images that adults might see. It's actually the platforms themselves, and it's children getting access to those. So our current content-based approach, where we just moderate the content online, is more damaging for free speech, but the only way we can get rid of that is if we introduce a ban. So basically, if you're under 16, you're not on social media at all. This is an adults-only space. If you're over 16, go for it. There are basically no restrictions on what you can see.
Another solution that you've proposed is Australia to adopt a version of the American Platform Accountability and Transparency Act. This is a bipartisan bill to improve data access to researchers and journalists. How is that going to change things? I mean, just knowing how the algorithms work, even if we could understand them, doesn't mean that we're able to control them or manage them.
It doesn't mean you're able to control and manage them, but you can at least figure out how they're working. Currently, no one really knows what these algorithms are doing. We had this discussion backstage before. We don't even think the executives at Meta know how these algorithms are working. So at least if academics, researchers, and journalists were able to access them, and the algorithms, keep in mind, are essentially just a very complex set of computer code. If they could at least see them, test them, see what they're pushing, what kind of things are being promoted or taken down, we could start to have a conversation about how we actually regulate social media. But until we're able to diagnose what the problem is, how are these algorithms actually operating, we're not going to be able to come up with a solution.
Lachie, you're someone who's very concerned about free speech generally. Do you think this is a problem for free speech?
Well, I'll just add that Freya's right. We should abolish the safety commissioner, absolutely, because that's a bureaucrat beholden to the government that's deciding on what content is and isn't allowed. Understanding how an algorithm works, I have no issue with that at all. I mean, that would allow us that should be transparent to everybody so we know what is being pushed and how it's being pushed. So I've noticed a number of times on Twitter, X, previously Twitter, a lot of people have put out posts that are actually showing how to get your post to go more viral. So hashtags are to be taken out, links to other websites are to be taken out, and that's because I believe it's open source now. And I think all these platforms should be open source so that individuals can best assess them and then disseminate that information.
Because they are controlling speech, aren't they? The platforms are controlling, through the algorithms, are controlling speech. Speech online isn't free.
It's free in that you can probably say what you want, at least on X, but what gets pushed is where you're going with that, I understand.
And that's exactly where I'm going with it, because Meta earlier this year announced a change to the platforms where they were going to stop recommending political content. And you're someone who is campaigning for political office. Your speech is not going to be seen by people that don't follow you on the Meta platforms, Instagram and Facebook.
Correct. I was also removed from Facebook during the pandemic for some opinions I had. But look, I mean, what I'd say to that is if we all went to the middle of the city, I mean, it's kind of related. If we all went to the middle of the city, had hundreds of people there having different conversations, those who are making the most noise and putting on a big show is probably going to get the most attention. And you could liken that to these social media platforms and what's getting pushed as well.
Could you? Because they might get the most attention, but will they be listened to, engaged with, and their words heeded? On social media, where everything isn't about the right to say things, but to have people view and interact with what you say, that's the meaning there of freedom of speech, I think. So if you go into the middle of the city and there's different groups of people and some are shouting on loudspeakers, whereas others are having interesting, thought-out, deliberative discussions, I'd argue that that group of people would probably get more takers. And the whole problem with the idea of the e-safety commissioner and all this stuff is that it presupposes that there is already freedom of speech on social media, when really there's a tyranny on social media that which is most inflammatory, that which has the most capital letters, that which upsets people the most, gets pushed the most because that gets the most clicks. And truth, good discourse, all the stuff that the Brisbane Dialogue stands for, that's getting pushed by the wayside. So I think the far, far, far broader issue is the algorithm regulation and transparency.
One of the things that you wrote about, that you've also written about, is the decision to switch off the news recommendations on Meta's platforms. And you argued then that young people get a lot of their news from socials. So turning off political content is going to have a really serious impact on the way that they engage with news and understand the world. Isn't your argument in favour of supporting social media in that regard then, if that's how young people get the news and information?
I think my point there was that in an ideal world, young people should get their news from reputable sources. They should read it in long form in newspapers and digest over a longer period of time the arguments, the points, fact-checking, all that stuff. But the reality is that we do get it from social media. So I think I was saying there that the question of content regulation aside, if we're going to have social media as it is, as a given, should there be news on it? I think yes. But more broadly, if I was able to shift the goalposts on that article and say, talk about this, I think my point could still stand and then supersede.
Because as journalists, one of the things that we're constantly being told is that we need to meet our audiences and readers where they are. And if that's where they are, then we need to be able to produce content that they can consume online so that you're engaging them in a way that they're already consuming it. So basically I'm saying, shouldn't we be trying to produce a better social media and provide content and information in a place that young people are actually receiving it, rather than trying to change that system or ban them from it altogether and force them to read newspapers that they're really not interested in reading?
I don't think it's possible. So I think news on social media or news not on social media, we need the news because otherwise we'll go without it and become more ill-informed. But I think the form regulates the content. You know, the medium is the message. So it was Richard Nixon in 1960 who complained that this was the first televised presidential debate. He didn't blame his speechwriter, he blamed his makeup artist, right? So that's in 1960 when he's complaining about creeping superficiality in politics. Now, in 2024, when everything is visual, when everything is the length of a short form 7-second TikTok video, I don't think there's any room for the substantial well thought out kind of argument and reasoning that good journalism and messaging requires. I just think it's incompatible, unfortunately.
Freya?
I would actually disagree. I don't think we've gotten dumber. I think humans are as smart as they ever were. We've got a much shorter attention span, young people probably, for sure. But I still think there's a hunger there for critical thinking and real analysis. But what I think we will see is the traditional media landscape will have to change to reach people. But the challenge for even social media news companies is they're all trying to get off social media because Meta and social media companies have all the power. If they decide we're turning news off, which is a big debate happening at the moment, will social media companies pay these news sites for their content on social media? If they decide to turn that off, their whole business model collapses. So I think you'll see new forms of media coming up where it's shorter form, quicker, in real time, but I think there will still always be a hunger there for critical analysis.
Keep in mind, what we're talking about is social media access for young people. And as I said, that is how young people are consuming and getting access to the news. So surely we should be making that more effective.
Yes, although in an ideal world, yes, but I'm not sure how you would necessarily do that. What would that look like?
You think the algorithms are the problem. So is it possible to make algorithms safe? Again, one of the things that we've been discussing is stopping kids from getting access to it. And you mentioned that's because of the way that the systems tweak our emotions, the way that they're designed to be addictive. Can we take the cocaine out of Coca-Cola?
I think the problem is, like, a shot of vodka is always going to be vodka. Like, there's no way you can cut it, that it's not going to be harmful. I think social media, one of the EU has basically put through a law where anyone, no matter what their age is, they'll be able to turn off their algorithm. So instead of seeing whatever the social media site recommends to you, you'll just see posts in chronological order. I think that's a good idea, but that's not going to solve the harm that's happening to young people. The platforms themselves, unless you literally made it no longer social media, like it was just a text messaging function, maybe that would be okay. But even then, if you had group chats, similar problems of social exclusion would probably arise. So I really think you could, basically, probably the most prudent approach would be to implement the ban for 3 to 5 years, give the social media companies time to come up with alternative models, which they're already doing. Instagram just released a teen-friendly account. Give them time to come up with models, propose new sort of child-friendly services, then evaluate those, and then see if it's safe to let kids back on. But in the immediate future, I don't see any way you could change social media to make it safe for kids. It's just not possible.
Okay, I saw you nodding at the idea of having algorithm-free feeds.
Oh, well, we could try that out. I think that would kill maybe quite a few business models. But I was just thinking, one thing I absolutely love is the fact that, and I was quite surprised by the statistic, but apparently 40% of 7 to 10-year-olds are on X. Is that? Someone said that to me just previously. Which is enormous, because I only use X for my news content. I actually don't go anywhere else for it. I think, for me, Instagram, Facebook, even TikTok is a waste of time. I only go to X for my news. And see, we want to have an informed public. We want to have an educated public. And so that's why I do think that this sort of regulation is more about controlling the information. And let me give you an example. You see, and don't quote me exactly on this, but my numbers are very close to being right. So CNN, and they're US examples, but they are. CNN, within a 24-hour period, they were getting about 60,000 views. Fox News was getting about 180,000. I put a video out last week commenting on these misinformation bills, and within 24 hours, I had 60,000 views. So the gatekeepers of information, the traditional gatekeepers of information, are really losing their control of the information and their ability to be that sole influence of the public. And I don't think it's such a bad thing that children, even young children, are engaging, especially with the news, because, they need to grow up. My grandfather at the age of 11 was driving a cane truck and running the cane farm because my great-grandfather had a broken leg. We have to all, we all have to be responsible and learn how to harness these new technologies, which is what I think really we should be focusing on.
So basically what you're suggesting is that we still need to be training young people to use the technologies that they're going to be growing into.
Yeah, exactly, because this is the thing that fascinated me, right? We all started questioning the news, but yet when I was at school, I was taught, well, the news always sensationalizes it to make it more interesting, to grab your attention, to make it entertainment. So we shouldn't be so surprised, and definitely we have to start implementing public health campaigns around this issue. Public schools should take off the mobile phones and educate the children on all the issues that we're raising tonight. We need responsible, informed adults and teenagers to inherit this world.
If your point then is that the problem with the news was that it sensationalised things, then surely you have to apply that principle to X, which is 100 times the sensationalisation factor.
Correct. So, then that's what gets things trending, gets attention, but individuals need to be critically thinking and learning how to digest this information.
Is the solution Danny's dumb phone idea? Do we ban smartphones for underage, for kids under the age of 12 or even under 16?
So I wouldn't support outright banning mobile phones, but
But you do support taking phones off kids when they go to school?
If the parents... Yeah, I do, because that's a government institution, the public schools. Private schools would be different.
Is that an idea that's going to fly, Freya?
No, I need Google Maps, and I did, especially as a teenager. So I think really...
They'll give it back to you at the end. And when
We're talking about, let's talk about the school.
Oh, in schools, definitely. Schools should not be in phones at all. There's absolutely no benefit to phones in schools whatsoever. But should we take smartphones off all teenagers? I think once we remove social media, the problems with smartphones will be a lot fewer. Really, the harm is being done by social media. If you think about what a smartphone is, it basically just has a really good camera. The internet, you should have controls on what your kids are seeing, like definitely make sure porn and everything is blocked from your home internet service. But yeah, really, if you can get social media off their phones, smartphones aren't too much of an issue.
Danny?
I think because we're talking about children, the question of freedom and the ethics of a ban kind of recedes into the distance, because this is primarily about a duty of care. I was saying backstage about someone I'm reading at the moment, Neil Postman, who is a media theorist. And he wrote a book called Politics in the Age of Show Business, Amusing Ourselves to Death. And he opens that by saying that the year 1984 came and went, and thoughtful people the world over breathed a sigh of relief that George Orwell's vision of banned books and government intervention, that didn't eventuate. But he said, well, that might not have happened. Aldous Huxley's book, his premonition, Brave New World, in which people lost their functions because they became addicted to pleasure, and they bought into that with no government forcing them into doing that. He said that that's more likely what has eventuated. So the books weren't banned. No one wants to read them. We weren't forced into any sort of problem, and that's what's coming here now. We don't live in fear of our oppressors. We actually love them, right? Kids love their phones. The whole point is there's a great rewiring of our brains, because when we get a Snapchat notification, the volume and the tone and the pitch of the ding has been engineered in a lab to give us a shot of dopamine, right? So I think, while it sounds quite horrible, ban mobile phones, I agree with you that it is a public health issue, and therefore that kind of supersedes that other question.
Loving our oppressors, isn't that where Winston Smith wound up at the end of 1984?
Yep.
Okay, so we seem to be reaching some kind of consensus that we need to be limiting access for kids to social media. The question is how we do it, whether we change the way that the algorithms work. We make them transparent, and directly or indirectly, we encourage the social media companies to alter the way in which they operate. Or we limit the access, or we teach kids, parents exercise a tremendous degree of control. I'm not sure that we necessarily agree with that idea. I'm certainly a little bit sceptical, having been someone who's tried to impose restrictions on the access of kids to social media. Or we place physical restrictions on their ability to access smartphones and social media on smartphones.
If I can add, putting aside the psychological issues that Freya's touched upon, when I was at high school, the most horrible, and I don't need to describe, but honestly, the most atrocious things that I ever saw were never on social media. They were on random websites that my friends found and decided to show me. Truth be told, probably not many people looking around the crowd have actually seen those sort of things, because you're of a generation that didn't grow up inheriting or with the internet. Because you can access anything. It is the freest place there is. And I just wanted to make the point that the worst of what I've seen has never been on social media.
But I guess my point earlier that I made was that it's not necessarily the content that's causing the mental health crisis among young people. If it were, then our e-safety commissioner would have solved mental health by now. That's not the issue. The issue is the way the platforms operate, what it does to our social networks. And so it's really not about whether, you see graphic videos of whatever. That's obviously, we don't want kids seeing that. But the issue that the harm social media is causing is not the content people are necessarily seeing, it's how it changes the nature of our relationships.
So you're effectively saying that having a social network that forces you or encourages you to place your status online, to communicate with your friends, isn't always a good thing.
Correct. And I'm super skeptical of any attempt to try and limit the content that's out there on the internet and even on social media, because inevitably it is a slippery slope towards censorship. And even there was the stabbing of Bishop Mari Mari in Sydney. This was a great case study in how difficult it is to regulate content on social media. The stabbing happened to be live streamed because it was during a church service. The video of the stabbing was uploaded onto all the different social media sites. The e-safety commissioner ordered all social media companies to take down the video. Everyone complied except for X. They took it down in Australia, but the e-safety commissioner ordered a worldwide ban on the video from being seen anywhere in the world. She then took them to court and withdrew the case because it was a completely ridiculous idea that Australia would be able to determine what content is available on Twitter around the world. But that just shows you our efforts at the moment to regulate social media are completely misguided. Some kid seeing a bishop getting stabbed, although that's horrific and shouldn't happen, and it would be great if they didn't see that, that's not the thing causing 46% of girls to get anxiety and depression. It's the way the platforms operate. It's how it is corrupting friendship groups and robbing children of a childhood. It's not the content that they're necessarily seeing. So yeah, I agree, we shouldn't be policing the content that's on there, but the only way we will be able to not police content is if we make sure anyone who's on there in the first place is old enough and mature enough to be able to cope with it. So that's why we need to implement the ban.
Danny, do you agree it's a question of age and maturity?
I think so, and I think in acknowledging that everyone's different and that a blanket rule or a blanket ban fails, it can become arbitrary, and figuring out who's equipped to deal with stuff and who can think critically, who can evaluate. Probably, judging from the bits and pieces that we do agree upon, this issue isn't so simply solved by one thing. So it might be that there should be a flat-out ban for 10-year-olds and under, and then maybe that mobile phone companies shouldn't be able to sell to 12-year-olds and under, and then that there is a national strategy for education for school children for living with social media during that time, and then that there's also pushing onto parents resources and help and subsidies to help them figure out how to parent in a time of social media. I think it's probably a mixed bag of solutions rather than just one.
And we seem to be coming round to the idea that we be treating social media a little bit like we do narcotics and alcohol.
Well, again, though, I know we regulate alcohol and so forth, but in the home, we don't have any control over that. And parents will inevitably allow their children to access their networks, I imagine. But I'll just add,
But in a supervised way, generally. I mean, some parents won't, some parents will be irresponsible, but it is in a supervised, managed way.
Yeah, but again, some parents won't, and social media, most parents will see as being vastly different to alcohol and so forth. But I'll just say, see, again, with the stabbing of the bishop that Freya brought up, I thought that was the strangest video to censor, because there was no stabbing. The knife never came out, the guy was bashing the bishop, and I think, again, that was about limiting information, because the bishop was a massively vocal proponent against the lockdowns and everything that happened during the pandemic. And they didn't want to draw attention to a particular individual that a lot of people were rallying behind, and obviously this makes him into more of a martyr of some kind.
Great. I think that leaves us in a wonderful place to throw open to our audience questions. It's been a fascinating discussion, but I'm also sure that many of you have ideas. I know that Simon has been collecting the texted questions, and so I'll hand over to Simon to select some of the choice of questions and offer them up to our panel.
Thanks, Peter. If you've got a question, just put your hand up and I'll come to you in a moment. I've had probably 60 comments while you've all been speaking. I'll try to draw them together into a couple of threads.
Were there any compliments on my head?
Universally, it was admired. One of the questions was, do we have any information from around the world where this has been attempted? Apparently there are 9 states in the United States who have done this sort of ban. Does anybody know what the outcome of that has been? And there's been some comments about schools where mobile phones have been locked up in lockers, and apparently enormous improvements in kids' behaviour getting out in the ground during the day, to the extent that parents have asked, but could they have one of these lockers as well? So I don't know whether any of you have any information about the results of these initiatives around the world.
I can speak to the US stuff. From my understanding, these laws, this is really the cutting edge. So nowhere, these laws around banning social media are only just being passed. So I don't think anyone has actually implemented this as of yet, but certainly a number of states have passed these laws, and this is the direction that things are heading in the US and really around the world. So I think in the coming sort of 6 to 12 months, when we actually start to see these laws being implemented, we'll start to see what the results are. So yeah, nothing's really happened yet.
I wrote about this a month ago, and at that time, age verification strategies hadn't been successfully implemented anywhere. Our government has set up a fund to now explore. The best shot that you can get to is, in some provinces in China, internet access is cut off at night time. So that's all so far that I've happened upon.
But see, the thing with the age verification technologies, this is a funny story. I got Twitter when I was 12. It was one of the first social media accounts I got because I wanted to repost Ellen DeGeneres' Donut Day or something. And I got it when I was super young. The other day, I went to view a post, and it was one of those blurred ones. It was about the Israel-Hamas war, so it was censored. So I had to verify my age in order to view the post. I put in my birth date, and I immediately got locked out of my Twitter account because it recognized that I was actually underage when I made my Twitter account initially, because the minimum age is 13. I was 12. To then recover my Twitter account, I had to upload a photo of my driver's license to Twitter to verify my age. So they have the technology. I firmly believe the social media companies know exactly how to verify our ages, but it is in their interest to drag their feet as much as possible. But they are doing it already.
Another theme was how you define a social media company. You've mentioned Snapchat and TikTok perhaps and Facebook, but are there many others? And what about gaming platforms where you can talk to people at the same time?
This is what Lockie was speaking about, isn't
Well,
it?
that's the biggest issue I see with us trying to implement something like this. And as I mentioned, like, it's very easy to clone apps and then create your own copy of Snapchat. That would just be an independent app that we'd have to then regulate independently, specifically. But yeah, like Discord. I don't know how many people are familiar with Discord, but that's massive, and it's a phenomenal platform that people can share as much as they can on social media.
Is it popular amongst men? I mean, Freya
I've
mentioned
never used Discord. I'm sure the girls in the room will relate.
Yeah, I can't speak on too many females, to be honest, of course. But on the Roblox thing, I know that my friends' children who are in grade 7 and 8, they only play Roblox. They don't have other social media accounts, and that's where they do all their networking with. And that's a female and a boy. The girl's older.
So the youngest comment was from an 11-year-old who mentioned Roblox, which I had never heard of, and said some very negative things about some of the comments that came through that particular program.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the thing. Like, these gaming platforms are free range because like they would have even less regulations than the social media companies. And I know because I've spoken to that parent about the content that her child has access to. I've raised concerns on that.
But I think that just goes to the point that really there's no such thing as a safe social media platform. I think how you actually define social media, it's got to have some sort of a feed so you can kind of scroll things and like and message as well. But parents should know there is absolutely no such thing as safe social media. There is no such thing as safe Discord. If your kid is online at all, talking to anyone, I really wouldn't leave them alone. Like, they should be supervised at all times. It's essentially the same thing as them smoking or drinking. If you're going to let them do it, which I would advise against full stop, at least be in the room.
As I said, you can't be over their shoulder at 2 a.m. when they're under the covers
Well, then
of
they
doom
shouldn't
scrolling.
be. They shouldn't have their phone at 2 a.m. Like, you have to remove the devices.
So educate and empower parents to remove the phones.
Yeah.
Like at the
What
end.
if the parents have to work 2 jobs and when they get home they have to cook dinner and then, maybe get 6 hours of sleep, and the last thing that they can manage to worry about is their kids, who we have each agreed are very crafty when it comes to getting onto social media and figuring out how to get onto phones. Like, empowering parents brings lots of different problems that affect different groups of people differently.
I'm with you on that struggle, and I think that's a failure of the direction that our society has gone in, that parents don't have the necessary time to spend it with their children and be present in their lives.
But making that statement doesn't solve the problem. Making a generalised statement about the failure of society doesn't really give anyone
we can implement.
there.
But we can solve that issue. We can lower taxes so that people have more money in their pocket to stay home and spend time with their children. We're in the greatest living crisis that I've most certainly ever gone through, and that's a consequence, I'll say, as big government. We have a cost of government crisis.
I think this is why we have to get back to the cultural change. At the moment, what is normal for a teenager is for them to spend 5 to 6 hours a day scrolling social media, completely unsupervised. That is normal. If we implement restrictions on who can access social media, we can at least stop that from being normal. Responsibility to raise your kids will always rest with parents, and as it should, but we can assist in changing the culture around how social media is used and kids' access to the internet. I think we're at a turning point now where we've seen the evidence. We've had kids on social media for 15 years, and what has been the result? A generation where almost half the kids in the last year have had some sort of mental disorder. Is that the kind of Australia we want to live in? And what will be the implications of that long term? Where that young people are the future of our country, and the young people that are growing up today as a result of social media are unfortunately probably the worst off mentally in our country's history.
I think that's quite that resonates with me, that point. You know, we can sit on a stage and talk about this, but if there is, as you say, research has suggested, a popular mandate for a ban among parents, and as there is, as I've mentioned, more than half of teens in the US wish that they didn't grow up with social media, perhaps there's no need to talk about it because most people are in support of it. But of course, always good to talk about it.
In the spirit of the Brisbane dialogues.
I would just add to that, and I think it's extremely valid. And see, what I would hope is that the generation who are growing up having experienced the negative consequences of this technology will take the responsibility on board to not let that happen to their own children.
Well, that's why we're sitting here. Because we've done just that. We've seen the harm and now we're saying it's got to change.
Yeah, and see, I would take it on board to restrict my children's access to such technology. And I think that many adults coming up now will take that approach because we all understand it was a negative, more so than a positive.
But lots of parents who have grown up with substance abuse issues, with gambling addiction, with problems that aren't just give and take, but that they're engaging with something which is actively engineered to skirt around their critical thinking and play on their brain and their dopamine. It's not just a case of they realise it's bad so they don't pass it on to their kids. And that's the exact same thing with social media. You know, people realise it's bad, but they can't get off it. And social media is engineered to play on our neural pathways. So I think that sounds good, this idea that we've grown up, realised how bad it is, we're not going to pass it on. I think there is that collective action problem.
And any parent who's hated themselves for it, but also seen a convenient digital babysitter, will know how sometimes circumstances make it easier for you to just leave your kids to it.
Peter, I don't know if you can see Noah upstairs, but he's got a microphone up there.
Yes.
There may or may not be people with a question.
Let's have some questions. And please, can I urge you to keep it to questions rather than statements, and keep them brief.
I just had a couple of questions, well, just one question really. I agree that cultural shift is vital to solving this problem. There's no silver bullet, and the best way to do it is to change a shift in society as a whole. I'm not sure if I agree that outside implementation on a ban is going to change culture in young people. I did agree with the point about education being vital. If there was a class in schools called Understanding Social Media, what would they teach to actually shift the culture in young people?
Freya, do you want to take that?
I think they would teach how to have healthy relationships, what a normal teenager should actually look like, how to communicate properly. I think a fundamental problem is that the whole nature of childhood has just been so reshaped. We've literally just had a bulldozer go through typical childhood, and it's changed everything. It's changed the way our brains work, it's changed the way friendships operate, it's changed the medium of social interaction. And so I think there's a real yearning among young people for a time before social media, like Danny was saying. So giving kids a taste of what life could be without constantly feeling the pressure of social media, I think that would, maybe if people could get a taste of that, that would be enough for them to, without a ban, take responsibility and get off social media. I agree in principle that would be the best outcome. I'm not sure how successful that would be, but yeah, I think a class would really have to teach kids the basics of being a human being with good relationships.
I think also, and lately I've started speaking a bit in schools about social media, and this has been what's had the most purchase. For me, I'm 19 and I've only really thought deeply about social media because I've been writing about it, because it's a normalised thing, and you don't think about the things or examine deeply the things that you take for granted and that happen every day. And so for me personally, it was interesting to sit down and write about Snapchat and to go, oh, wow, the Snap Map is a horrible den for stalkers and social pressure. I've never thought about that in my 19 years. No one's ever talked about it because we've been raised with it, because it's been put in front of our faces before we can properly reason and criticise. So I think classes like these ones that are potentially proposed could just ask simple questions that let the students then do the active reasoning and at the very least develop a cognizance of what's wrong with social media. For example, you know, asking kids, discuss among yourselves, do you think it's good that when you go on Snapchat and you open the app more than 40 times a day, you see your own face? And when you send streaks to 100 of your friends every day, you see your own face yet again. And you know, that bend in your nose that you don't like, or you might think your cheeks are chubby, right? That's something that our parents and grandparents didn't go through. Asking those questions so that students then can think to themselves, this thing that I carry around in my pocket isn't normal, isn't healthy, isn't good. That could also be something alongside what Freya suggested.
It seems we do need to have a conversation around culture shift and around the social norms around how we manage social media in a way that we really haven't until now.
I'll just add real quickly, the culture aspect. Awareness is probably the best medicine in those classes, but building the culture can be as simple as if we remove phones from children at school and called that the digital detox, or parents start implementing a digital detox on the weekends. Those habits would most likely carry on throughout life. It's something that I've recently learned about, and take the phone off yourself for a day.
Question here, please.
Yes.
Hi, Phil Harris here. Thank you all very much for your input tonight. It's been a wonderful breadth of knowledge, and clearly you're well knowledgeable about this stuff. I've just got a couple of sort of points to come through, and first I'll ask forgiveness. So please don't judge me as a single parent of 3 kids that I might have used occasionally the phone to keep them babysitting, but still. But the core issues that you're raising there around social anxiety and mental health from there, eating disorders and things like that can come from this, have been in existence well before social media. And social media has maybe exacerbated that, but as I was growing up, there was passing notes around the schoolroom, there was magazines with images, there was calendars, etc. These things existed, the problems were still there, they were talked about. Unless we're fundamentally addressing what is underneath and causing that behaviour, social media is the facilitator, not the thing that needs to be corrected. And I thought by banning, I'm not sure actually about achieving that, although I assume you're going to ban kids from writing notes and reading books, etc. as well. But so what are your thoughts on how that underlying behaviour could be fixed, so that we don't just fix it for the half the percentage that's now increased in these things, we fix it for the underlying group?
Yes, and I agree with your point, and I tried to make that earlier, that like social media is the setting of this behaviour, and the danger of a ban is that it could be potentially lazy or heavy-handed in that we think, okay, we've done a ban, we don't have to worry about all this bad behaviour that's going on. So I think in that being said, that's why perhaps a multi-pronged solution is best. So we have the ban where we can degrade or dissolve or water down social media, which even though it is the passive, the setting of the behaviour, it does magnify and multiply and make portable and put in your pocket the writing of notes and the real stuff that used to happen. So it does increase that. So if we have a multi-pronged solution that deals with the setting, but then can also come and try to rectify the behaviour through maybe, classes, through helping out and giving resources to parents, and maybe through a cultural change, that's how you begin to, that's my thinking at least.
Freya?
I would say, yes, these issues have always existed, but like we started the conversation saying, in 2012, there was an inflection point where all of a sudden the rates of mental illness just shot through the roof. So it's not just depression and anxiety that's worse now than it ever was before. The completed suicide rate is double what it was for the baby boomer generation. So kids are more miserable than they ever have been, and they're actually doing something about it. It's not just that they're getting diagnosed more or they're talking about it more, they're actually physically manifesting signs of incredible misery at double the rates that they ever were before. So I think this is an issue we absolutely cannot downplay. If rates of mental illness for young women had remained consistent with their 2012 levels, today we would have 260,000 fewer girls experiencing a mental disorder each year. 250,000 girls could have been spared from a mental disorder in the last year had we not had that change, which has been largely caused by social media. So it's a public health crisis that I think a lot of young kids suffer in silence, and these issues have always existed, but they have just reached new proportions now, fueled by social media. So I don't think we can downplay that.
And I think also with phones, with school and notes, you walk out of school and leave the bullying behind, and you don't have to engage with it until you go back the next day. With social media, it travels with you, it follows you, it's always there. Now, next question.
Quick question up here.
Where are we? I can't quite see.
Question for Danny especially. How do I get my hair to look like this? If teenagers are incentivized to skirt these laws and companies are incentivized to eat young people's attention, why would they respond to the ban? And then if it's about duty of care, who deserves that duty of care to protect those children based on who is incentivized for the long-term well-being of those young people?
So on the first point, why would companies comply with a ban? Freya, you've done the policy side of things, probably because they would be compelled to by the government and we'd have laws, but also because it could increasingly become in their commercial interests, because people have a growing awareness of the insidious place that social media has in our culture, especially its impact on kids. So it might be the shareholders of a company or the market at large that grow in this. You know, why did Coles and Woolworths have an incentive to charge extra for plastic bags? They don't, until it became a conscience thing for most of the broader public to which they were selling. So there's that. And then the point about who's got the duty of care. As a law student, there's interesting torts ramifications here, Freya. But I think, it's the cocaine in Coca-Cola argument, perhaps, Peter, because, let's not get it wrong. We're talking social media again, because it's a big part of our lives. When we think of it, we don't kind of jump or get extra sensitive about it. But the impact which social media has on young people, which has been articulated, is akin to, and we've equated this to, substance abuse issues, to cigarettes and alcohol. That's the actual statistical impact it's having, and it's showing up in the increased rate of suicides. It's killing people, or our use of it is killing people. So the duty of care, I personally don't think it's too great a stretch to say it's on the providers who knowingly market to young and vulnerable people who are often under the age of 14, 13, 12, right? I think the moral duty of care is to them, especially when they're dealing in a product which isn't like drugs and alcohol, right? So you could say that the duty of care for Grey Goose Vodka Company isn't the company, it's the parents of the kids who might be buying the vodka. You could be right in saying that, because it's not that hard for parents to make sure that their kid can't get their hands on a bottle of Grey Goose vodka. But when it's social media, which is a living entity on the internet, you need qualifications to be able to stem that. So I think that would be my response.
And Freya, you've also written about this idea of a duty of care from the social media companies. You're saying that they should be obliged to make a statement of a duty of care and be accountable to that.
So how the UK has legislated social media reform is they've actually put in the legislation that social media companies will now owe a duty of care to their users. Because the problem with social media is that they have a whole product around getting kids addicted to social media, and to do that they have to rewire their brains, and they know exactly what they're doing. So from a legal perspective, essentially through legislation you just say you now owe a duty of care to the users of your platform.
But if you go back
you can then sue them.
But if you go back to what you were saying earlier, it's like, I don't know, asking Pablo Escobar to hold a duty of care to the drug users. You know, the problem isn't the care, the problem's a product.
So this gets us back to the original argument we were having. I am personally cynical and skeptical about the prospect of there ever being such thing as child-safe social media. So that's why I think until social media companies, and the onus should be on them to prove that social media is safe for young people, until they've satisfied that and satisfied that it's safe, then we shouldn't let kids on it at all. But yeah, other countries have taken the duty of care approach. And I think it'll take a couple of years to see whether it does anything. But yeah, in the meantime, nothing will beat a ban.
Question down here.
Hello. I was just thinking, is it not likely that social media, and including their negative impacts on children's mental health, prepares young people for mature and resilient thinking surrounding like conflict and social issues? And I guess as a young person myself who has struggled with mental health, and I can attribute some of that to social media, I just personally feel more prepared, and I think it's helped me grow up, and I'm just hoping we're not like shielding young minds from being able to mature properly and become resilient. Can I just have your input on that, please?
Well, I'm in alignment with you there, because as the previous question that came up before, which is the benefit of someone who's got perspective of previous generations, these issues were around. And look, I was someone who didn't grow up with actually social media at high school, even though my friends all did. And I took tremendous heat from my friends. I was greatly teased a lot. I never took my shirt off in front of anyone because of the teasing until I was about 20. So there are struggles that will affect individuals in the real world as much as online. And see, that's what I talked about with responsibility and the maturing of individuals who have access to these platforms through the content that is on there. I think that in a way, we're creating a generation. Yes, there's consequences always, but that's where the education comes in, that is going to be very equipped and have a much deeper understanding of the world that surrounds them.
So your argument is a little bit like the French approach to giving their kids a glass of wine over dinner and teach them to be responsible use.
I think that's actually quite valid, because in Australia, we would all admit we have a terrible binge drinking culture, which I saw at the colleges I went to. In Europe, they don't drink like us, because in Europe, parents usually will have a glass with their child or something, which teaches them the responsible consumption of alcohol. Prohibitions don't generally work.
I really love your question because, you know, we are all called the snowflake generation. And here you are saying that perhaps these make us even more resilient. And I've never considered that because, I mean, that's probably true. Like we're not actually war-torn in Australia, but in a way we are pretty war-weary because we have these struggles that are new. But I think my perspective is that restricting social media for young people wouldn't be denying something which will help us come to terms with what real life is like, because generations which existed before us managed to be resilient and grow up strong enough without social media. But I'm conscious that I'm saying this in a time when social media is now an immovable aspect of modern life, and maybe the fact that we grew up with it from the age of 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 or whatever is in itself a preparation for it. But that's a pretty scary thing to even think about.
I would say from a neurological perspective, it would probably have the opposite effect of making us resilient, because studies have shown that social media actually reduces the grey matter in your brain, which impacts your reasoning. It also alters your dopamine systems. So I would say the rewiring of kids' brains through social media is probably, if anything, having the opposite effect. It's amazing to hear that you've experienced the harms of social media and come out the other side, and that's so good to hear. But I think from a group level perspective, if we think about what's actually happening to the brain chemistry of people, I think it would probably be having the opposite effect. And if social media were to have any positive impact on resilience, after a full generation being exposed to it, we probably would have seen that in some of the data, but actually we've kind of seen only the opposite. So yeah, it's a great question though, yeah.
Simon, have we got any more questions? Before we take this question, I'm just going to ask you, I'm going to spring a bit of a surprise on you. You read out a comment just before we came in here. I'm wondering if you could retrieve that and give us that comment at the very end. Not right now, just dig it out, but we'll take the question. I'll give you that chance just to find that one.
I was just wondering what your thoughts are on why it's been legislated 16 and under. Why is it not higher, or why is it not lower? So we're all high school teachers here, and we're just wondering, I'm wondering, why 16? Why not lower, or the adults at 18? They only have to pay adult prices from 12 years of age. Is there a medical reason? I'm just wondering what your views are on the age of 16.
I can kick that off. So if you look at the data, it seems to be that the most sensitive age for girls, so it's basically when you're going through early puberty. So for girls that's slightly younger, it's like 11 to 13. That's when girls are particularly vulnerable to the effects of social media. For boys, it's slightly later. It's 14 to 16. And so the thinking was you want to make sure that both those critical points are covered. So that's why we chose 16. I mean, if I had my way, to probably be to 21. No, I'm joking. 18. Like drugs or alcohol. But 16 is kind of when your brain is probably better able to cope with it from a scientific perspective.
We have a question down the front.
So the poet T.S. Eliot, he famously wrote a letter to Times where he warned England about adopting television because he'd seen the detrimental effects it had already in the United States. And I'm just wondering, and it has had consequences before, we don't even sort of can see now. I'm just wondering, what sort of framework should we use for determining whether new technology should be adopted? Because it seems to me once it's already out of the box, it's a lot harder to then put it back in the box.
That's really interesting, and I mentioned earlier Neil Postman, who wrote about TV in politics and how it degraded things and forced politics, which is meant to be boring, which is meant to be substantial, forced it into becoming superficial, about sound bites, about how you present yourself, about how you look, who's interesting, who's inflammatory. And this guy, Neil Postman, had 6 points that he ended up writing about the introduction of a new technology. Questions you have to ask about it. So I don't know what to say now that social media is out of the box, but he analogized television with the introduction of the clock in the 12th century, and his main rule was that technology giveth and technology taketh away. And the clock, when it was introduced, gave a lot. It gave us accuracy and ease of timekeeping. We could now meet at 12:25, wherever, right? But in giving us that ability, it also took, and in the case of the clock, it took away humankind's observant streak. We didn't pay as much attention to where the sun is in the sky at certain times, or what colour the leaves turn, or the length of shadows in the day. And social media, even though Postman died before social media came into being, social media giveth the most, but it taketh the most. So we've grown up texting one another from bed, you know, from our couches, from at home. We've gone to restaurants, and if we want to know what the food is like, we'll consult Instagram and, you know, search up the restaurant and see what their linguine is like, right? And that's given us so much, but it's taken. So because we're always texting one another from isolated points from bed, we're seeing one another and actually socialising less. Therefore, social media is taking away our ability to socialise healthily and naturally. Because we're going into restaurants and consulting Instagram rather than the waiter or a person next to you who actually is having the linguine, again, we're becoming lonelier, we're becoming driven into within ourselves. And, you know, social media gives us an eye to the world. I wake up and I see what's going on in war zones, what's happening here, what's happening there. So it's given us that knowledge. But again, it takes away. And in the case of Gen Z, which has grown up with social media, it's taken away the natural state of not knowing that much in real time around the world, which is an important thing and a luxury because it means you're less frazzled, fatalistic and frightened. So I think when technologies come and are proposed, you know, Mark Zuckerberg has had his landmark glasses that he unveiled the other day. We need to ask, what is this going to give? But also, in giving, what will it take, I think.
I think that's a wonderful, a little round of applause. That's a fantastic point. I'm now going to wrap this up, I think, and I'm going to leave the last word before I hand back to Selena to a comment that we had, which very early on while we were in the green room, and I'm going to ask Simon just to read it out. It was a text that arrived very early on.
It arrived 10 minutes before we actually started the meeting. And it's from a 13-year-old, and he or she says, as a 13-year-old who will actually be affected if this ban is put into place, I feel that putting a ban on social media for under-16s would do nothing. Teenagers would just find a way around the ban and the precautions put in place. If anything, it would just encourage teenagers to break laws and rebel. Once they get around these bans, it would make teenagers believe they can get away with other illegal things, like drugs, etc. Honestly, I don't think this ban will actually stop anything. Do you agree with this?
We'll leave that question as rhetorical. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank my panellists and my fellow panellists and welcome Selena back to the stage.
That was absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. And if you don't mind, I have to add one comment, if that's okay, because I've been studying this for a really long time. I'm a brain development, mental health and child mental health advocate. I've been studying the brain for 30 years. I'm here to tell you the research is very clear. The brain is changing. And not only that, and the reason I'm so vocal, both in newspapers, in inquiries, and this is the piece no one wants to know about, is that our children are being targeted. There were 300 million children exploited online. The Childlight Foundation just released the data. Snapchat is currently being sued by New Mexico because its algorithms are matching pedophiles to young children. That's why I'm so vocal. And if you're not in arms, I couldn't sleep for most of last year, which is why I rewrote my book and put a phone on the cover. And I am quivering because if you knew what I knew, there would be no question. And it is what is actually happening. But only 3% of parents in Australia want to know this because it's too horrific to believe it's true. So the FBI just released an alert 2 days ago, 18,000% increase in financial extortion of boys 10 to 17 using Snapchat, Discord, Roblox, Penguin games for 5-year-olds. So I'm very vocal because I want to see, as you mentioned, a multi-layered public health campaign. I'd like to see parents educated. I'd like to see digital literacy. I'd like to see a therapeutic goods administration like the FDA set up in Australia so that tech companies have to prove that they're safe for children. We shouldn't be having to prove. So it's a defective product right now. So let's do the recall. So thank you. Thank you so much for being here, for trying to make our country as good as possible. These conversations are so important. Peter, brilliant moderation. Thank you. And I have to say, Gen Z, you're amazing. Are you really 19? Are you really 20? I mean, I couldn't do what you did at 19. So there must have been something good about social media. No. Absolutely, it's so articulate. Our country is in really good hands. So let's show our appreciation one more time for our beautiful panel. So to conclude, thank you for being here, for being part of this such important conversation. All feedback, inquiries, offers of support, introductions to continue these conversations in our country, please send them to Murray and Simon. Thank you for creating the Brisbane Dialogues and trying to get this into a national conversation. It's so needed right now. Thank you. For those that have registered, you'll receive a post-event email containing links to a brief feedback form. I please encourage you to respond to that, as it's key to building these dialogues. And to a youth-oriented online forum. It's very important that young people are included in all these conversations. At Cauldron today, and experiment in carrying on tonight's discussion, which is very important that we keep the conversation going. It just doesn't end tonight. So volunteers, event partners, premium ticket holders, you're invited to join the speakers in the lower bar. And everyone else, please stay. Come and meet us, talk to us, carry on the discussion at the What's Golden Bar on the other side until the lovely staff tell us it's time to go home, which I believe is 10 o'clock. Is that right, Murray? Maybe. Okay, across the road too. Thanks again to everybody for your contribution to this occasion and discussion tonight. Please carry it on at home. And that's what I keep saying. Tonight, we're about, how many people are here? All you have to do is tell 5 more people. And if you understand exponential mathematics, within a short time, we're a very small country. That's only 25 million people. So if we keep telling someone, I want to tell you you're very powerful. Politicians are currently listening. We're in election cycles. We can make a difference right now. And this is such the most important difference that you'll ever make for our country going forward. So please take it on. Take this conversation. Tell them what you've learnt. And keep your kids safe. There is zero places safe online for children in 2024 because of AI-enabled algorithmic changes, and every place has a messaging app. To what Lachlan mentioned is absolutely true. So I am making a statement that we have to get rid of smartphones for children until they're safe. And I'm not going to back down on that because I know too much. And I'm here to tell you everything online is like that right now. So please help us help our children be safe. Thank you.